By October of 1969, the Zodiac killer had already terrified Northern California. 3 attacks, multiple victims, newspaper letters, ciphers, threats, and one of the most recognizable criminal symbols in American history. Yet despite all of this, the killer remained unknown. Police departments across the region were searching for him. Reporters wrote about him almost daily. Citizens followed every development. The Zodiac seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Then, on the night of October 11th, 1969, he made a decision that would bring him closer to capture than ever before. The city of San Francisco looked very different from the isolated roads and lakes where previous attacks had occurred. This was a major urban center. Busy streets, apartment buildings, traffic, police patrols, witnesses. The Zodiac had previously chosen secluded locations where victims were isolated and vulnerable. This time, he entered the city itself. Around 9:45 p.m., a taxi driver named Paul Stein picked up a passenger. The passenger appeared ordinary. Nothing about him attracted attention. No mask, no threatening behavior, no obvious warning signs. Just another fare entering a cab on an ordinary evening. Paul Stein had no reason to suspect danger. The trip began normally. The taxi moved through the city streets. Eventually it reached the Presidio Heights neighborhood, an affluent residential area lined with homes and apartment buildings. What happened next would become one of the most important moments in the entire Zodiac investigation. When the cab stopped, the passenger pulled out a weapon. A single gunshot ended Paul Stein's life. The attack happened quickly, but unlike previous crimes, this one had witnesses. People inside nearby buildings looked out their windows. They observed activity around the taxi. Some saw the suspect. Some watched him moving around the vehicle. Most importantly, they immediately contacted police. For the first time in the Zodiac case, multiple witnesses were observing the killer during the crime itself. And those observations would lead to one of the most frustrating moments in criminal history. After shooting Paul Stein, the Zodiac did something unexpected. He did not run immediately. Instead, he remained at the scene, calmly, methodically. He removed a section of Paul Stein's shirt. This detail would later become critically important because it provided physical evidence linking future Zodiac letters directly to the murder. The killer then began walking away, not sprinting, not panicking, walking. Witnesses watched him leave the scene. Descriptions were quickly relayed to dispatchers. Police officers responded. The city suddenly became an active crime scene. What happened next remains one of the most discussed mistakes in the entire Zodiac investigation. According to later accounts, an initial radio broadcast incorrectly described the suspect. As a result, responding officers were looking for the wrong individual. At roughly the same time, one police officer reportedly encountered a man who may have been the Zodiac himself. The man appeared suspicious, but because the description circulating among officers did not match perfectly, he was not detained. The encounter lasted only moments. The man continued walking and disappeared. If the individual truly was the Zodiac, then the killer came within minutes of arrest. Some investigators later described it as the closest authorities ever came to capturing him. A simple communication error, a few incorrect details, and the suspect may have slipped away forever. The possibility continues to frustrate researchers decades later, because unlike theories and speculation, this moment feels tangible, real. The Zodiac may literally have walked past police officers, then vanished. Meanwhile, investigators examined the crime scene. The murder differed significantly from earlier attacks. This was not an isolated lover's lane. This was a city street. This was not an attack against a young couple. This was a working adult, a taxi driver performing his job. The victim selection appeared random, the location bold, the risk enormous. Many investigators believed the Zodiac was becoming increasingly confident, perhaps even reckless. His communications suggested growing arrogance. The San Francisco murder seemed to confirm it. He no longer needed remote roads or isolated lakes. He believed he could strike anywhere, and perhaps more importantly, he believed he could escape. The investigation intensified. Witness statements were collected. Composite sketches were created. For the first time, the public received a reasonably detailed visual representation of the suspect. The famous Zodiac sketch emerged from witness descriptions. A white male, adult, glasses, short hair, ordinary appearance. That last detail proved especially unsettling. The man did not look unusual. He looked normal. Someone who could blend into a crowd, someone who could pass unnoticed on a city sidewalk, someone who could live almost anywhere. The sketch generated enormous public interest. Tips flooded into police departments. Potential suspects multiplied. Investigators pursued countless leads. Yet once again, the case resisted resolution. The Zodiac remained hidden. Then the letters resumed. Weeks after the murder, communications arrived that included pieces of Paul Stein's shirt. This evidence shocked investigators. The sender clearly possessed material taken from the victim. The letters confirmed what many already suspected. The Zodiac had murdered Paul Stein, and he wanted everyone to know it. The communications also served another purpose. They demonstrated control. The killer was reminding police that despite their efforts, despite witnesses, despite sketches, despite citywide searches, he remained free. For law enforcement, this was deeply frustrating. Each letter felt like a challenge, a reminder that the investigation remained incomplete. A reminder that the suspect still controlled the narrative. As 1969 approached its end, the Zodiac case had become one of the most famous investigations in America. The murders were terrible, but the mystery had become equally powerful. People debated theories, studied letters, analyzed symbols, and searched for clues. The Zodiac understood that attention itself was part of the crime. Every headline increased his influence. Every news story expanded his legend. Yet behind the symbol, behind the letters, behind the mythology, there was still a real person, a human being committing real murders. And investigators were determined to find him. The next phase of the case would focus increasingly on suspects, men whose names would become associated with the mystery. Some appeared convincing, others less so. One suspect in particular would dominate discussions for decades: Arthur Lee Allen. To many investigators, he looked like the strongest candidate. To others, the evidence never quite fit. The search for the Zodiac's identity was about to become as famous as the crimes themselves. And more than 50 years later, that search continues. In the next episode, we examine the suspects, the evidence, the theories, and the question that still fascinates the world: who was the Zodiac? This is Echoes of Humanity TV, youtube.com/Echoes of Humanity TV.